Coming up next on Insights on PBS Hawaii, what will be the impact of Hawaii's decision regarding same-sex marriage? Aloha and welcome to Insights on PBS Hawaii. I'm Malia Mattoch. The passage of the Marriage Equality Act has at times been highly contentious, sometimes pitting neighbor against neighbor as thousands have turned out in Hawaii to voice their opinion. But what comes next for our state? Some will challenge the issue in the courts, others will rush to take advantage of the new law. What does the new law mean for us in terms of the economy, education, and culture? Will this continue to be a divisive issue, or will we learn to accept our neighbor's point of view? We invite you to join our conversation by calling, emailing, or tweeting your questions and comments. Now to our panel. Bishop Robert Fitzpatrick is in charge of the 9,000-member Episcopal Diocese of Hawaii, which was the first church to support the new law. Sam Slom is a state senator who has voted in opposition to the bill because he does not believe it protects the rights of religious organizations not wanting to perform same-sex marriages. Chris Lee is a state representative who is at the forefront of the Marriage Equality Initiative. Chris believes 80% of the people in his generation support the initiative. The Reverend Gary Secor is a Vicar General of the Roman Catholic Church in Hawaii. He has been with the church for 36 years. Father Gary has testified against the measure on the basis that it would redefine marriage. Thank you all for being here tonight. Senator, if I may start with you, there was news today. Yes. Circuit Court Judge Sakamoto refused to issue a restraining order to stop the state from issuing marriage licenses to gay couples. Your reaction to that? Any thoughts on future court challenges? Will we be seeing more?
Well, I think you will be seeing more. I think that Representative Bob McDermott deserves a lot of credit for championing this issue in the courts. Those of us that are familiar with the courts and also familiar with the Constitution knew that there was very little chance that there would be a ruling in our favor. It's something that I've argued over the years, for example, that if a legislature passes something, there's no guarantee that a future legislature will not overturn that or go in a different direction, because one session cannot bind another future session. So that was that. That was the issue.
That the legislature, a future session, holds more hope for those against this than, say, the court system does?
Well, certainly I think we're constrained by the court system. I think what this issue brought about, however, was a clear understanding that the people thought that they were voting for one thing in 1998 very clearly, and all of the materials and the advertisements and the statements by the state were very clear at the time. But that was a different time, 1998. We have a different legislature now. 80% of the people that are in the legislature right now were not in the legislature at that time. But there probably will be additional actions brought, because many of the things that were brought up in the testimony over the nearly 3 weeks were that you're going to have unintended consequences. You're going to have a lot of different things occur: education in the schools, small businesses, auxiliary, ancillary activities of churches and religious groups. So there's a lot more to go on this. But my position from the beginning was, number one, for 20 years I've said the government should not be involved in marriage, number one. Number two, I was very vehement about saying this special session was a not so special session, should not have occurred. We were talking before the show, in the past 12 years, there were 2 special sessions that were not related to the Senate's responsibility for confirmation of judicial and cabinet nominees. One, the most recent one, had to do with the super ferry, but the first one had to do with 9/11. And both of those, I think, were significant issues. My point of view, and I'm very clear about this, is it was the governor that called this special session, not the legislature. The governor wanted it, the legislature didn't want it. The governor wanted it because he's slipping in the polls. The governor wanted it now instead of during an election year, next year. And I think that this is going to backfire on him. I think it's going to have a lot of political consequences as well. So we can get into that later.
All right, a lot to react to there. Representative Lee, I would imagine you've got some other thoughts.
You know, I do, and I think that the governor actually called this from his own perspective because it's the right thing to do. You know, we have a legislature and a state that has been asked by the governor to take action, and we did. I think the special session, as the Star Advertiser pointed out this morning, was the right way to do it, to ensure a process that is most inclusive. During a regular session, you're never going to have the opportunity to stop everything and hear 5 days of testimony on a bill, or have weeks of notice in advance that a bill's coming up for a hearing. And so going through that, I mean, we had fantastic dialogue, and it was the right way to make sure that you maximize public input. I did want to touch on something looking forward. You know, of course, our current legislature cannot bind a future legislature. We cannot say this is the end of the line for this issue or any other. Future generations are going to make that call for themselves. But I do think it's going to get more and more difficult as time passes to go the other direction and step backward because, as you mentioned earlier, I do think a vast majority of our younger generation now growing up support this issue, support it as an equal rights issue for everybody, and support treating everyone with the same respect and aloha, particularly here in Hawaii, that we all deserve. And I wouldn't say across the board 80% of our generation, which you mentioned earlier. It depends on the demographic you're looking at, the location, but generally, younger generations by far and away support this overwhelmingly.
Father Secor, what was your reaction to this session, and where do you think we go from there?
Well, I agree with Representative Lee that everyone needs to be treated with love and respect, everyone, including our gay and lesbian brothers and sisters. From our perspective, we don't think that the legislature should have been about redefining marriage. We feel that this was a manufactured civil right, that certainly civil rights are very important, but in our view, there wasn't a need to redefine marriage to give civil rights for marriage to gay couples. Certainly, people who understand themselves to be gay or lesbian have the right to be who they are. But in our view, there's a difference between having a right to be who you are and activity or being married. In our view, marriage is already restricted in many respects. You can't marry your sister, you can't marry your brother, can't marry a certain cousin, you know. So we don't think that it should be construed as a civil right identical to other civil rights, which we are very much in favor of, but not this one.
Bishop, a civil right?
Well, it is in the sense that, I think the senator touched on this, as long as the state's involved in marriage and it's part of common law that we've inherited in the United States, it means that issues of civil rights and equity do come into play. So unless the state gets out of the marriage business, and unless married couples' special privileges that are granted to them by the state are removed, then it's by necessity an issue of civil rights, and for some of us an issue of pastoral care.
All right,
let me just add to that, first of all, because I have taken the position that it is not a civil right. And in fact, there's no court in the country that has ever ruled that same-sex marriage is a right, or that marriage is a right, as a matter of fact. And I think today, one of the problems nationally and locally is that we have people demanding, we have special interest groups that demand certain things. We want affordable housing, we don't want GMO, we don't want this, we don't want that, and they call it a right. And we're mixing up license and privilege with right. But I wanted to re-emphasize something that I said at the outset about why I didn't think this was a required item for a special session. Look, this is not an urgent issue. It was not urgent at this time. What is urgent is our state is suffering economically. We are really in poor condition. We've got almost everybody in this state that is struggling now more so than they ever did before. We've got infrastructure problems. We've got health problems. We've got all of these things. We've got children who are being abused and all that. We say we're the state for the keiki, and yet we don't pass something like Jessica's Law and don't take care of them. So it's a misplaced, in my humble opinion, a misplaced issue where you put sexual orientation and people's private choices above what the legislature really should be doing.
But Senator, that's good.
Yeah.
I agree with you.
Yeah.
So now it's behind us. So now we go forward, I think, on issues of immigration, of caring for the poor, of dealing with poverty, of dealing with issues of economic justice, that I think certainly the Roman Catholic Church and the Episcopal Church can work together on.
And that is the question is going forward. And one question, of course, about economics is the University of Hawaii is saying that this could give Hawaii a $217 million boost. Your reaction to that?
Well, there are all kinds of studies, and we've seen that in the last 20 years. And one of the problems is when we started this discussion, and I've been involved with it for more than 20 years, it was all about love and compassion and equality. What we really found out during this special session was it wasn't about that at all. It's about benefits. It's about tax privileges. It's about making equal people in different stratas and different classifications. And I had said all along when people were advocating, for example, reciprocal beneficiaries, and then domestic partnerships, and then civil unions. If there were things to be done, then we should have done them. Certainly the Congress had the ability to do that, and the legislature had the ability to do that. But what the message I got was, all through this, is we want the same benefits as those guys have. That's what it was. So I think we should keep that in mind. As we go ahead, you were saying at the outset, if we can respect other people's views, and I absolutely believe that. I talked about civility and respect all during these discussions and previously, and we should always be respectful on any issue. But here you had a situation, unlike any other before, where the community has been split, so diametrically. Every one of us probably has individuals of homosexual persuasion. That doesn't mean that we love them any less, but the issue is not that. The issue is trying to force legislatively one particular point of view opposed to another point of view, one freedom of speech issue, a religious issue, opposed to another. And so while we'll get together and we'll all sing Kumbaya and we'll sing Aloha Oi and all of that, these divisions will remain because you can't force people to do certain things that they don't believe in. And I think that people that came down here in the thousands, in record numbers, we never before saw that before, they're going to remember that they didn't get any solace from the executive branch, from the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. I just want to make sure that they stay together and they will work for things like initiative, referendum, and recall, and term limits, which we don't have.
All right, well, let's talk about the political fallout. Representative Lee, do you think there's going to be a lot of fallout in the next election on either side of this?
You know, I actually don't. And I think if we look back to the civil unions debate, which happened just a few years ago, there was equal opposition and support in the community. You had a whole lot of division, and folks came down to the Capitol. And at the end of the day, it became an elections issue. And the Advertiser and other mainstream publications were asking, where do you fall on this? Put out there to the public. Some people even had attack pieces done based on that issue. But at the end of the day, pretty much everybody who voted for it came back. And we are now here, and we had a vote on same-sex marriage, which is civil unions, in a sense, rehashed. And yet, we are here, and I don't think anyone expects to have a change politically because of it. But let me step back for a minute. You know, when you talk about rights, and I do agree, benefits and rights being parsed out equally to all families is critically important, because everyone's going to have children, they're going to be raising their families whether this bill passes or not. And to be able to have the federal benefits, to be able to have those tax incentives to help pay for their kids to go to school and raise them right is critically important, I think, for any family, and any parents would agree with that. You know, we had $217 million the University of Hawaii said the state's going to benefit from additional tourism, from additional revenue for folks coming in. It's not just wedding ceremonies producing these things, but it's people staying here, coming to these wedding ceremonies, spending money. Our small businesses, more than anybody, stand to benefit hugely because of this. And so we had 200 plus businesses, large and small, come in and say, this is the right thing to do, it's going to help us, in addition to providing basic rights and equal treatment for everyone.
Okay, I want to get to, we're getting a lot of questions. From Sharon, do the opponents to gay marriage favor letting the people decide, and will they abide by the decision of such a vote? Will they drop their opposition if a majority of voters favor same-sex marriage? Any thoughts on that?
Well, let me speak to that. Quite frankly, I don't believe that the issue of the nature of marriage should be put to a vote. I believe my understanding of God and what God has designed us as is that marriage is between a man and a woman, and that doesn't change just because the majority feels differently about it one way or another. So while I think the effort to let the people decide is well-meaning in terms of, well meant in terms of respecting the will of the people, from the beginning we, the Catholic Church, haven't felt that this is something that should be voted on.
So you would not want to see a vote. Would anyone want to see a vote?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, we had a vote. That was what 1998 was all about. I had somebody at the neighborhood board tell me last week, yeah, but that was 15 years ago. Well, the Constitution of the United States was over 200 years ago. The fact of the matter was, it was a vote. 70% of the people said that they were voting for a traditional marriage between a man and woman. I reiterate my point, though. I don't think the government should be involved, but they are involved. And since the government is involved, I think the message to these thousands of people that came down to the Capitol over the last 2.5 weeks was they thought that people were going to listen to them. And look, hey, come on, let's be honest about this. This whole thing was scripted from the very beginning. It was a done deal. Everybody knew what the vote was going to be. I don't think one vote actually changed from August until now. The governor thought he was going to get away with this in 5 days. It went into the 3rd week, and it was because those pesky people got in the way. And they wanted to have a voice. What I said earlier was, we say that the people are smart enough to vote for us, they're smart enough to give us perks and benefits and exclusions and all that, but they're not smart enough on an issue that has divided the community. Let the people vote, and let's see if, for example, 80% of the young people, if they vote, have changed their mind. I didn't get that from the testimony. I think that there are people that have their views, but they're really upset that they came down to the legislature and they found that nobody was listening to them.
I do think that this is an issue where you look back at the history of the country and you look back to interracial marriage being legalized. You look back to civil rights, to women's suffrage, to ending slavery. None of these were up for a public vote. And specifically because we don't vote on our constitutionally protected rights in this nation. They are there, they are protected because we don't subject the rights of a minority to the will of a majority who may tyrannize them. And so looking at this, what we are saying here in Hawaii is that we want to hear from the public. We have duly elected representatives. We are a democratic republic which is set up that way to voice the will of the people through their elected legislators. Hearing 5 days of record testimony, I think it was 57 hours worth of tens of thousands, or I think up to almost 5,000 people who had signed up, and then tens of thousands of written testimonies beyond that, gave us the opportunity to weigh this issue. And what we did was come out with a compromise bill. I think I disagree with the senator saying not a single vote changed, everything was scripted, because we went in without, I think, expectation. The governor had a bill on the table which didn't even get introduced. At the end of the day, that was language that was amended. We heard a lot of the concerns about protecting religious freedom on the parts of various churches who didn't want to have to be forced to solemnize anything or provide ceremonies in their facilities. And we carved them out and made significant changes. I think that is what the process is all about.
And I'm glad you brought that up. I want to make sure we are getting so many questions that we cover how churches are moving forward going to handle this. In the Episcopalian Church, what now is going to happen?
Well, we've already had civil unions and the blessings of them. In the Episcopal Church, theologically, it's still not holy matrimony, the blessing of a same-sex union. We are also a federalist system. The same folk who designed our Constitution designed the U.S. Constitution. So it takes us a long time to decide anything. But we have an authorized liturgy for the blessing of same-sex couples.
So if a same-sex couple comes to you once these marriage licenses go out, I believe it's December 2nd.
The priest has the personal option of being the officiant on behalf of the state. Now, I think that's an important distinction. Clergy act as agents of the state when they sign a marriage license. That is not a religious action. So they'll sign the marriage license as an agent of the state, and then they will use the rite authorized by the Episcopal Church to bless the union. And I make that distinction because that gets us, that's where part of this confusion, I think comes in the United States, is the religious freedom, I think, must be upheld and respected. At the same time, the agency of the state is another aspect that takes place whenever a clergy person officiates at a wedding. And so in the Episcopal Church, what I've asked my clergy to do is be sure their folk understand that they've had a lesson, they've thought about it, they've talked through the theology of marriage and the theology of inclusion. Then each individual priest can choose to officiate or not officiate.
So if they are uncomfortable, if they do not like the concept of same-sex unions, they can decline.
Yes. And pastorally, what I've asked them to do is call one of their neighbors or call me. And we will find a way of dealing pastorally with the couple.
And do they tell the couple, this is the reason I'm declining?
I would encourage them to, because that's honesty. And that's always the most important part of the pastoral relationship.
And isn't this interesting that we've had in increasing numbers and increasing years the discussion about separation of church and state, which of course is nowhere found in the Constitution. And yet, as you've said, you now become an officiant and an agent of the state. So I don't know whether we're progressing in doing that or not, and I'll still hold up the fact that we shouldn't be involved in it. I want to get back to one thing that Representative Lee said, though. I don't want to beat a dead horse. But the fact of the matter is we would not have had a special session had not the governor been able to twist arms and guarantee that he had the votes, which were obtained behind closed doors, there was no public meetings, before the session was called. If he didn't have the votes, we wouldn't have done this.
Senator, you are beating a dead horse.
Okay, well,
pretty much.
Sometimes we have to beat it.
But
people forget. I think that's one of the things.
But Senator, you're also, I think, by beating the dead horse, that is the political reality. And those of us, as we are adults, we live in the real world, you're absolutely right. But the horse is dead. So you've done a good job.
See, politicians often believe that they're safe in doing what they want to do because the people will forget.
But Edmund Burke would have disagreed. I mean, I want my representative to vote their conscience.
Sure, I do too.
And then whatever comes of that later, that's part of our process.
Yeah, but I think the whole issue here is that the public is finally realizing that representatives have not done that good a job in representing them because they say this is what we believe in.
We just missed the line of Burke in conservative philosophy. Representing conscience is not always representing the will of the people.
Yeah, well, and I would point
so
out
we'll have to wait till November to figure that out.
Next year.
And see what happens in the election. So look at the passions that come up because of this topic. Why do you think this topic is so difficult for us all, or for the public, to talk about? What makes this topic so charged?
I think there's a long history here, both emotionally and historically. You go back and folks have been raised generation after generation in a society that that framed things one particular way. Particularly, I think as we've seen this past year from a religious perspective. Back in 1997-98 when this issue came up last, prior to civil unions, there was a fairly large religious coalition built around the issue in opposition. And that was based on some of those religious values and beliefs, many of which were still out here waving signs and everything this year. But in time, that has started to change. And I think we see across the nation, not just here in Hawaii, a generational shift. Just as we did moving past civil rights and moving past interracial marriage, where folks today are far more understanding of their gay brothers, sisters, family members, neighbors who were always there, but for whom there was social pressure not to acknowledge their existence, not to talk about this. And so for the first time, I think we're seeing that we're acknowledging that a minority exists here, and we're granting them the same equal treatment that everybody deserves under our laws.
I look at that a little differently. I think it's a broader issue than that. I think that many of us in the community and nationally have seen over the last decade particularly that things that we held dear and things that we grew up with and things that we believed in have been stripped away. Prayer, for example. We don't have prayer in the state senate anymore or the city council. A pledge of allegiance, things of this nature. We've seen things because of special interest groups. I mean, Representative Lee mentioned the Star Advertiser, our monopoly newspaper. They've been cheerleaders. They don't report the news. They've been cheerleaders for this and other issues all along. And I think a lot of people have become very frustrated because they figure their vote doesn't count, their voice isn't heard. Look, we went from #1 in the nation in voter turnout in the 90 percentile. Now we're number 50 at 48%. Of course, if you believe our president, there's 57 states, so maybe it's not quite that bad.
Senator Slom, let me ask you this question that came
Sure.
in from Gordon. Will Senator Slom drop his opposition to same-sex marriage if the electorate votes in favor of gay marriage, or does he favor a vote simply because he thinks his side will win?
No, absolutely. I believe in whatever the people decide, that's what I'm governed by.
Okay.
But, and that's why I find it really frustrating when I hear voices saying there's been this shift, there's the wave, everything has changed, but we won't allow the people to vote on that.
All right. Let me ask this. I mean, back in 1967, when interracial marriage was finally legalized by the Supreme Court, only 20% of the American public approved. Should that have been then put to a public vote at that time?
And it's funny, this is a question from Karen. Senator Slom, if separate but equal had been put to a vote, do you think schools would have been desegregated? I think it's ridiculous to put minority rights up to a vote. That's what the courts are for, leading on to your question.
Well, I think, first of all, it's the legislature. I think we've punted and we've deferred to the courts where we should have taken our own responsibility. What I said during the session, because this has come up over and over again, the difference between interracial marriage, the difference in other civil rights is just that. We're talking about civil rights and we're not talking about it here. Specifically to answer Representative Lee's question, no, I don't think that that should have been a vote. And I think that when we look at what the courts have done, even in the DOMA, the Defense of Marriage Act decision here, we find that most of these important decisions are 5 to 4 votes, one individual. But we have to, I think, allow for people to have more participatory democracy, and they feel that they are not entitled to that now. That's the real issue, and that goes beyond same-sex marriage.
All right. Father, let me ask this question of you. Whose religious rights are being inhibited if no one is required to perform a same-sex marriage? Can you take that question?
Well, certainly, as far as what we understand of the bill that has been signed into law, we are protected as religious ministers, as priests, from having to perform marriages. And thanks to the amendments in the House of Representatives, our facilities are much better protected than I believe they were in the original draft of the bill. So we as Catholic priests are not going to be forced to perform these ceremonies. Our concern is with regard to our members who may have other businesses, who may quite probably be forced to provide services that may go against their conscience.
Business community.
That's correct.
Under this bill, if there is a wedding vendor who is approached by a same-sex couple who declines to participate in their wedding by providing flowers or catering, then they are not protected under this bill. Representative Lee, can you speak to that point?
Sure. We had this debate on the floor of the House. We had a bunch of amendments introduced that posited this question. And ultimately, those amendments were voted against. And the reason was because, not that we don't support people's freedom to act, but we do maintain that here in Hawaii, we do not discriminate, and we do not enshrine discrimination in the law by giving any business the ability to opt out. Because if you opt out of this, you're, according to the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, opting out of all protections based on a sincerely held religious belief. So that would allow any business down in Waikiki, for example, to put a sign in the window saying, "No Jews allowed," because it is against our religious belief. Or many examples worse than that you could imagine, based on gender, based on race, based on sexual orientation, based on anything. But the most important thing I want to point out is that no other state, not one, whether it has same-sex marriage or not, has adopted this provision because it is so dangerous in that respect. And finally, I would say that the law actually hasn't changed where by passing this bill. The bill does not touch this issue because this is an issue of public accommodations. And so previous to this, if you're in a civil union and you went to a florist, for example, who had an issue, they're already by law not able to discriminate.
The same way
so this doesn't change.
They couldn't discriminate against an interracial couple who were wanting to get married.
It's based on their sexual orientation, not on the fact that they're married or in a relationship.
Yeah, from our perspective, it's not just about, the issue of public accommodation is not just about accommodating a person who may consider themselves to be gay or lesbian. That's not the issue. The issue is an activity being accommodated that is against one's conscience. I mean, we're not saying that gay or lesbian people shouldn't be present at certain places, you know, but it's the issue of what the couple wants to do and have other people participate in who don't feel comfortable with it based on their conscientious beliefs, you know. That's the issue. I think I'd like to go back to what you said earlier about why was this such a passionate issue. And from our perspective, there's nothing more important than how we live our lives. None of us are angels. Not only are we not perfect, but we have bodies. And what we do with our physical selves is not incidental to who we are. It's an essential part of who we are. The only way you can express yourself, your love, is with who you are physically. From our perspective, gay marriage is symptomatic of a much more pervasive misunderstanding of human sexuality. I think many heterosexuals don't understand human sexuality. Priests who have violated their vows, let's just say it with young people, horrible. Certainly, we're not understanding what the gift of human sexuality is about, or how it should be respected. So from our perspective, this effort to legitimize gay marriage, from the Catholic perspective, is symptomatic of a much broader issue. And that's why I think it was so
And Father
passionate.
Gary, I think that's actually why it was passionate across the street in a different way. That in the Episcopal Church, especially the Diocese of Hawaii, since former presiding Bishop Browning was bishop here, we included gay and lesbian folk in our common life, and in that slow understanding of moving to saying they're fully part of us, they're really our brothers and sisters. How do we include? We bless. We make them part of the ohana to provide that safe place for those two people to live out their baptismal promises. So I would say that we actually are saying the same thing. We've arrived at different conclusions, and how it does get confused and passionate is around the civil question, where you and I could have a respectful conversation around the theological implications and the family implications. The difficulty comes when it crosses the street and ends up in the legislature or with the governor.
The difficulty comes when we're talking about force. When you're forcing somebody to do something.
No,
oh, yes.
No,
and when
I
we get back to small businesses,
no.
you're going to find out, as other jurisdictions have, that people are going to force their way into businesses, not allowing them their freedom of choice. You can call it discrimination, or you can call it choice. No, not necessarily.
It is discrimination. I'm
Representative
sorry,
Lee
Senator.
brought up Jews. I happen to be Jewish. It's a very different.
Which is perfectly fine.
Yeah. Well, we're glad that the Episcopal Church recognizes this. Good.
I mean, it's our origin. We get that.
But what I'm saying is we have diminished people's ability to not only think for themselves and to express their viewpoints, because viewpoints themselves have been condemned and have been criticized.
Oh, absolutely, on both sides.
On both sides. I agree with that. That's right. But what I'm saying is you've got people in business where the government, and what we've done really is create a new category of litigious action, and we are a litigious society. Sure. We have created something that was not there before, allowing people to sue, and sue they will, because there's enough attorneys around and there's enough activists around. That's what they want to do, and they've shown that before, and they'll continue to do that.
Let's go back and say that the law has not changed.
Exactly.
The law has not changed. If you're a business owner and you discriminate against somebody for based on their sexual orientation the day before this bill was passed, and you do it again the day after the bill's passed, it's the exact same thing.
All right, I want to get to some of these questions because we have so many. Education. This is a question from Jenny in Kailua. How are children going to be protected from educational curriculum that teaches about same-sex? Representative Lee, you want to take that one?
Sure. You know, one of the things we heard throughout this entire process was that there's all these crazy things that could be taught to our kids, how to have sex, how to have homosexual sex, whatever that is, because heterosexual and homosexual People do all kinds of things. But at the end of the day, you look at other states that have been referenced, like Massachusetts, for example, have been brought up time and time again. And you find that a lot of the arguments being made have no merit, are being taken out of context. And what we're finding is that even before the bill was passed there, back in 2006, there was only one change to the curriculum. And all it said was, children in the course of an education shall be taught different family structures, so that you could have a family with a father and a mother, with two mothers, single parent family, a Hanai family, what have you. But it says nothing at all about marriage, about what is right, what is wrong, about anything to do with sex at all. And here in Hawaii, we've heard from our DOE very clearly that there is a very clear opt-out provision, so that should anything ever come up like this, a parent would be notified beforehand that indeed there is some controversial issue coming up. Feel free to opt your child out, and they have that right. And that's protected by the Board of Education, the Department of Education. The bill itself does not speak to education at all.
Now for the rest of the story. There were many people that were very concerned about that aspect of it, and they did point to Massachusetts, they did point to Canada, but they can point to Hawaii. I brought up in my remarks that there's been a program in effect. It started in my area, Niu Valley Intermediate School, called Pono Choice, developed by the University of Hawaii. And the curriculum is very clear. They say that the whole program is to prevent teen pregnancy and sexually transmitted diseases. But there's a component in that curriculum which speaks to homosexual relations very clearly. And when you talk about the opt-out position, a lot of parents said that they were not given that opt-out. They didn't know about that. The DOE did bless it because now there's going to be 30 schools that will be using that curriculum at a taxpayer cost of $1 million. But it is in there, and it has been in this case since 2011.
So it was there before.
Pardon me?
It was there before
2011.
This discussion.
Yeah, 2011. But I mean, that's what parents were talking about. And for legislators to poo-poo that idea or say, oh no, that's not going to happen because we have the DOE and we have the BOE, I would say, look at their past record and things that they have done, and the fact that many people have felt that they did not have an adequate opportunity to opt out. So it is an issue. It's a real issue.
So that's a systemic issue that will need to be addressed, about allowing parents the option to opt out.
And I return to the fact that whether it's there or not, no matter what happens in the future, it has nothing to do with this bill.
Well, it does. It does in effect, because what you're doing now, you have state sanctioning of homosexual activities, which you did not have before. But the other thing, from my standpoint, let's agree on this, if we can. We got kids that can't read. We have kids that can't do math. We have many kids that don't know history or geography. But at 12 years old, they're going to know all kinds of sexual positions and sexual things. Where's our priorities?
Now, was that in, the curriculum you just saw?
Oh, yes, it was. Yes, it is. Yeah.
Before we belabor that dead horse again.
Well, we get a lot of dead horses.
Yes, we do. We got a whole
in an hour, you get a lot of them leg around.
But I would say that going back, I mean, we do not have this as a part of the curriculum based on whether or not marriage is legal or not based on this bill. And at the end of the day, I mean, you're talking about wanting to help promote better education for our kids, which I think everybody can agree on.
Sure.
And you look back to the original intent of the bill, which is to build households that have solid families where parents are loving, whether they're a mother and a father or a mother and a mother, what have you, because those families are in our community right now. They're going to continue to be in our community, and we have to give them the same benefits and treatment and respect that any other family has, because that's what's going to make the difference to whether or not their children are raised well.
So let's switch the focus and looking forward, what are the issues now? Now that we've come this far in this issue, what are the issues that you're going to be looking at in your communities? Father.
Well, I think we realize that we have a lot of work to do, just in terms of educating our own people regarding why we stood so strongly against same-sex marriage. Our own people don't always agree with us on this issue.
Do you feel that there will be somewhat of a backlash in terms of some of the positions that the churches have taken in this? Do you have any concern about that, about some members feeling that they didn't want the church to take as strong a stand?
We've already received some of that backlash, certainly. I wouldn't say a large number of people, but we certainly have heard from people in our own congregations who strongly disagreed with the Bishop Silva taking the position that we have taken, and we understand that there is disagreement within our own congregation. I think for us, all the more reason for us to articulate our ethic in a positive and engaging way. That's what we really need to do. I think we're way behind in terms of doing that. I think not just about the issue of homosexual relations, but about the whole issue of the human person and who we are.
Bishop, what are your thoughts on that? Have you had anyone unhappy at the position that
that's been our past. And that has been part of the Episcopal Church's struggle over the last 20 years. And so less so now, because that is part of the struggle of time. I think right now, as we look ahead, because we've struggled with including whole families, both, for me, it's a pastoral issue. So that when I have someone meeting me when I'm in church and they say, my daughter wants to get married, can it finally happen? Then it's a personal pastoral issue. So that now I think the growing edge will have to be in two directions. One, the continued teaching of what it means to be in a permanent, sexually exclusive, respected, honored relationship. And how do we hold up those families, but all families, within the life of the church. But I think also calling those of us of faith to look at those other issues that are before us, issues of homelessness, issues of poverty, issues of economic justice, climate, those other issues that press upon us as people of God, holding this fragile earth with our families around us and with those all around, and looking beyond, for us, this one issue that gathered way too many people at the Capitol, I think, but also respecting those who disagree, that where we can work together, we get about God's work to care for the broken and the lost and the poor.
And to the point of this bill and this law, are there families that you have ministered to that you believe this bill will help?
Absolutely. Oh.
Can you speak to that? Because that's some of the questions we've gotten from callers, if we can address sort of the impact on the gay community.
Yes. I mean, folk who did not have the resources to fly to another state to be married. Families that I know of who are waiting so their children can be married in their churches, in their church. And it was more than just the blessing after a civil union, but that understanding of marriage that's grown for some of the people. I've been a priest for almost 30 years. I've been married for over 30 years. The entire time I was a priest and then as bishop, I've had gay and lesbians in my parishes. I've had families with children. Their lives never affected my marriage. They've added to my marriage because I've seen in those couples wholeness, permanence, care for one another to the point of death. I know there will be people who want to get married as soon as, on December 2nd, they'll be waiting for the stroke of midnight, and I will have priests who will perform the weddings because they're part of our church family.
At the stroke of midnight.
I honestly believe it.
Representative Lee, any thoughts in terms of improvements to the life of gay citizens of the state of Hawaii?
Oh, absolutely. And I think in the hearing, we heard from hundreds and hundreds of people, many couples who've been together for 20 or 30 years who are looking for that opportunity. And I think you're right. December 2nd, I think I've already got about 4 or 5 invitations. I'm going to have to say I'm not going to anybody's because I want to be selective, but I think it's going to be fantastic for them because for the first time, their children will look at their parents and say, you are the same as everyone else's parents in my class. And they're not going to be facing that kind of segregation as they grow up. There's recognition that they are a true family, and that's what this is all about.
Father, I had a question for you. It seems from what I've read as if this new pope has a bit of a softening on the issue of homosexuality. Is it possible that at some point in the future, the Catholic Church might change their position on this?
I think that it's been interesting how people have reacted to the Holy Father's comments, and they've reacted on 2 extremes. Those who have an agenda in favor of gay marriage have reacted and said, look, he's opening the doors, everything's going to change. On the other side, those who are very conservative have said things like, somebody better get to him, he's causing problems. I think what the Pope is really doing is precisely what we're doing here. He is saying, let's talk with each other, let's not talk at each other.
Yes.
And so I think that's the sort of tone he's setting. Now let's be clear, he has not changed one church teaching. The church teaching is still what it is, which
that's
yes,
different.
it's a different tone perhaps, and the emphasis I think is on, as I said, engaging others in a conversation. We are still not going to agree that this behavior is moral from our perspective, but certainly we need to listen to one another and talk to one another about this. And I think that's really what he's saying ultimately.
Moving forward, in terms of economic impact, let's change the conversation a little bit. There was a question, why when civil partnerships didn't benefit Hawaii economically, why will marriage? And I suppose the answer is that people are going to want to spend money on weddings. Is that the anticipation economically?
There's 2 parts to it. The first is that, and hearing in the testimony over our 5 days, 57 hours of folks coming in to talk about their own stories, a lot of folks didn't want to go the route of civil unions. They wanted to wait because they felt it was only half measure, and it was kind of, for them, a slap in the face saying, you're still not the same, you're still not equal. And that's something that I think was taken into account by the UH study, looking at the effects from the past few years, looking ahead, and what's being said now is that you got $217 million in revenue coming in over the next, I think, 2 or 3 years, based on the fact that there's been a lot of built up drive to get married by this community that has, to this point, been prohibited from doing it.
Your thoughts, Senator Slom, on the economics?
There will be a lot of excitement and a lot of activity initially. That there's no question about that. But in terms of overall economic benefits, look, I go back to the fact that the single most important issue that I'm facing is the lack of genuine economic activity in the state. And that affects everybody, whether they are gay or straight, Republican or Democrat. We're not doing our job. Every ranking that's come out in the last 2 years that's ranked Hawaii on economic vitality or business climate has put us at the bottom of the list. That's not acceptable. And what we're doing by issues like this, we are deflecting where the issue should be. I wanted to say one other thing, though, again, about these benefits. As it came up in the hearings, I think it was mentioned that there were federal benefits, 1,938 benefits, which you can get if you go to another state. Some people think that's a difficult thing, although many people have gone to other states to get married anyway. I look at it differently. I think that that's too many federal benefits. I think if the taxes are too high, that's a problem in the state of Hawaii. We're being the 2nd or 3rd highest tax state in the nation. I think that's where we should put some of our energy. The issue now, from my standpoint, should be behind us to the extent that we move on. And I certainly agree with you that we look into homelessness more, poverty more, all of these other issues. But if you don't have an economy that treats everybody equally or with equal opportunity, then you've got real problems down the road. And those people that think that we couldn't follow in the footsteps of Detroit or Greece, they're fooling themselves. We have the highest unfunded liability of any state in the nation at over $25 billion. Our people are struggling every day in terms of rent and food and health care and all of these things. That's the responsibility of the legislature.
Father Gary and I'd like to join you on another panel about economic justice.
Faith.
I think that would be very good.
That might be the idea. Yeah. All right, moving on. Here's a question from Terry. Does the panel feel that since the religious community is so divided on this issue, the arguments against SSM based in religion have less weight? Any thoughts on that?
Oh, religion generally in the West and in the United States particularly is becoming less important. We are entering a phase, I think, you can go to Europe and see empty churches. And the succeeding generations are struggling with their spirituality and their religion differently than past generations. I think that when religious communities can come together, show civil discourse, work together in a reasonable way for the cause of good and justice, we can actually model to the world a healthier, wholer way of being. We're not served by one another standing on opposite sides and yelling slogans. So this could be a model. We could find a new way forward.
I think what's happened to some extent with regard to religion is that the issue of compartmentalization has occurred, where I think people, many people consider religion to sort of be something I do when I have a baby, I get a baptism, or there's a funeral, or a social occasion like a wedding, but it isn't really integrated into the wholeness of their life. And from our perspective, that's what needs to happen, that religion and faith becomes part of who I am, and that I don't check my conscience at the door, that freedom of religion is not about freedom of worship only. It's about something much bigger than that.
Father, do you see any benefits in this law having passed? I know it's not the outcome that you or the Catholic Church wish for, but if there's a silver lining, is there a silver lining?
Well, I don't see any benefit in the law being passed as what is legislating as legal. What I do see is that it certainly has pointed out to us that we have a lot of work to do in terms of awareness with our own faith community regarding issues of sexuality and public engagement, certainly.
Senator Slom, other than the economic boost that is expected, do you see any benefits from what the state went through the last couple of weeks?
Well, it'll be good for the lawyers because there'll be more litigious actions. Other than that, no. When people say Hawaii, the Aloha state, are they going to say we are the same-sex state, we are the same-sex marriage state? Is that going to be a major point? And I would point out, again, the rush was to beat Illinois, which is going to be, next week they're going to sign, and they'll be the 16th state. But that still means that, the majority of states haven't adopted this. And other states put forward, this is what we want the public, or we want the rest of the nation or the rest of the world to look at. I would say it's very narrow if we're just talking about same-sex marriage.
But it's now almost 1/3 of the country that has adopted this, right? And so it's not as if Hawaii is going to, if I'm understanding your point, in terms of an identity. I mean, we
tried to be first, as we were with abortion, as we were with the general excise tax, as we were with a single statewide school district, as we were with prepaid health care. We didn't make it first. And the fact that we've been debating this and discussing this for 20 years, I think indicates that, again, I have no problem sitting down with people, and I think that's what we should do, and we should talk and we should exchange our views. My problem comes when you start talking about the state using force to change people's views or make them do things that they don't want to do.
All right, we're starting to run out of time. I want to make sure that we get everyone's thoughts here. Representative Lee, any other points that everyone in the public should be aware of and looking for on this topic?
Well, I do think that you'd asked earlier about what's good coming out of this, besides the benefits to same-sex couples and everything else. I do think the one thing that struck me during the hearing, I think it was day 4, was the fact that there was a lady who testified, and she got up and said, I submitted my testimony in opposition 4 days earlier. Finally, it's her turn to speak. But then she changed her mind and said, you know what? I'm changing my comments to comments, meaning she's not taking a position. And she looked at the crowd and the folks wearing their colored leis and everything else and said, I didn't realize you don't get Social Security, you don't get Medicare. You're a family, you have kids. I didn't realize your kids go to probably the same school my kids do. And so bringing understanding from both sides on the religious values and beliefs that are important to some and the families that are out there who just want to be families and treated like everybody else, I think is fantastic, because the bill's done. We can agree to disagree, but putting ourselves in others' shoes and understanding their issues, I think, is what ultimately brings us together.
It's interesting, reading the letters to the editor in the last few days, you can tell that there is a lot of anger about this, some of the comments that have come in. What would you counsel those for whom this was not the outcome that they wanted? Bishop, What would be your thoughts?
Well, I think what we've done tonight is what you do. You talk. You engage human beings. You understand that you're going to disagree. But you struggle with what you're disagreeing about. You treat one another with respect. You treat your brother and sister as if they were part of your family. And you live together as best you can. You make things pono. And I think we can do that without anger, without rancor, without demonizing. And there are other places where we can work together for the good of the whole.
Really quickly, final thought. Father.
I certainly agree with the bishop. I think where we might disagree a little is, from our perspective, a pastoral outreach for us would involve also a challenge to a person who is oriented that way to look at their behavior. But certainly there are many issues that we're concerned about mutually as churches and just as people in general that we need to focus on.
And move on to the other issues affecting us all. Thank you all for joining us here tonight. It was very interesting. Next week on Insights, for some with catastrophic illnesses or facing the end of their lives, the idea of dying on their own terms is comforting. Only a few states allow so-called death with dignity. In Hawaii, there have been repeated attempts to pass laws allowing physician-assisted suicide, but none have passed. Proponents say that we should have the right to dictate how we die, and opponents call it manslaughter. On the next Insights on PBS Hawaii, should we have the right to decide how we die? That's next time on Insights on PBS Hawaii. I'm Malia Mattoch. A hui ho.